Let's see. Some of you have had some issues getting into the discussion board. So let me show you. I'm going to share the class here and go into the discussion. So all discussions work the same way. So we have the icebreaker discussion. I click on the icebreaker discussion. That opens the icebreaker description. It really doesn't open the discussion. It just opens the description of it. And then you have to go all the way down to the bottom and click on the link to actually access the discussion. So you click on the link and that brings up the discussion. And now you can actually click on reply to reply. The first part is just a description of it. The second, the link, is actually the discussion. So for those who are having a little bit of trouble, that's the reason you're having trouble, is you think you're in the discussion when you're actually only in the description. But once you've learned it, you know it. So every single discussion works the same way. So today we're going to be working on history and science of psychology. We will, for the next 2 or 3 days, we'll be talking about history and science of psychology, and then we'll be moving on to the biopsychology. We'll get through with it way before the August 29th date so that you have time to study your notes and do your quizzes and discussions based on what I've actually lectured on, rather than do the work and then get the lecture. PowerPoint, here we are. Yes, all right. Okay, so and there are no questions. I haven't seen anybody typing any questions, so let's get started with the PowerPoint presentation on the history and science of psychology. There are a lot of other different types of sociology, anthropology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis. These are different groups that also study the mind of people and the way people act. And we'll actually talk a little bit about each one of these. So the sociology first. Sociology studies groups of people to see how the group functions as a whole. We do have in psychology a group of psychologists called social psychologists that study groups of people also, but they don't study the group in order to find out how the group works like sociology does. We study the group to see how it affects one individual in the group. So that's the difference between sociology and psychology. Yes, we both study groups of people, but we as psychologists study them to find out how the group affects an individual in the group, whereas sociology studies the group as a whole and how the group works together. There is a science fiction book called The Foundation series written by Isaac Asimov. Has anybody ever read that book? Are you science fiction fans, any of you? So I haven't read it from Michael, but I don't know. Okay, no. All right, there's no yeses. Most I got no's. This is the story, okay? Let me tell you the story, and there's a reason for me telling you this story. In the Foundation series, there is a person who has figured out a mathematical formula that can be used with all the variables in it to describe how people react and act. And if you can change the variables, then you can actually make people do things that you want them to do. A sociologist figured this out. And in the science fiction book, the government has control of that formula so that they can stay in power all forever, because they can manipulate the variables and make the society vote for them and think that they're wonderful. And so there's one person who's born who can make other people do what he wants them to do, called the mule. That's how the government defines him or describes it, as the mule. And he's throwing off the formula, and so the government has to find him and kill him. That's the basis of this science fiction book. Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. And the reason I bring it up is because there are sociologists working on mathematical formulas, and one sociologist from England, he calls himself a sociobiologist. He has developed a formula that seems to work that predicts how women in groups of 5 or more will shop while they're shopping together in a group. Now, whether it works or not and whether it's a viable, useful formula or not isn't the question. The thing is, there are people working on formulas to define how people act in sociology as groups. And even in psychology, there are people who are working on formulas to define how an individual works. If you can manipulate the variables in the formulas, supposedly you can define how that person will work in the psychological realm. So kind of cool. And there is actually, we'll talk about it in the learning chapter, a psychologist who says, give me any normal child as a baby, and by manipulating the variables in his life, I can make him into anything I want him to be. So he believes that he has the formula that can do that. Now, anthropology is very similar to sociology, but they define entire cultures rather than just a social group, as sociologists do. They define large groups, cultures, and we think of them as studying ancient Egypt and the Mayan cultures, the old cultures that are gone, but they can study the cultures that are right here in this time and place right now, modern cultures. There's a place in Virginia called Mount Trashmore. Anybody been to Mount Trashmore? It's a beautiful park. Got a weird name, Mount Trashmore. Some of you have been there. So what is Mount Trashmore? Why is it called Mount Trashmore? It's called Mount Trashmore because it's a trash dump. It was a place, a huge hole in the ground that Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, and Norfolk and Portsmouth all poured their trash into until it filled up. And then they smashed it all down, covered it all over, and made a nice little pocket. It's like, if you actually went into that area and drilled a giant pipe down into the trash, you could pull up pieces of trash and you could see in a time frame, basically the stuff at the bottom is the stuff that was put there when it was open. The stuff that's at the very top of it is the stuff that was there when they closed it. And you can define how the culture was, what people were doing by what kind of trash is in Mount Trashmore. If there's trash at the very bottom of Mount Trashmore that is used up, I mean, you can tell that it's an item that's been used, fixed, used again, fixed again, used again. If you can tell that, then you know that the culture at that time was not very wealthy. People were using up stuff and trying to keep using it as much as they could. At the top of the Mount Trashmore, the top layer, you might find stuff that's almost brand new that they've thrown out. Well, that means that the culture at that time must have been wealthy. People were just throwing stuff out that was almost brand new and maybe it didn't work the way they wanted it to, so they just threw it out. So you can tell a lot about a culture from its trash, and that's anthropology. And archaeology is the method by which anthropologists work. Psychiatry and psychology are two very different things. Psychiatry is the practice of medical doctors. You have to be a trained medical doctor first, then you can train yourself in psychology and become a psychiatrist. But the idea that psychiatrists have is that everything is a medical problem. There's something medical, there's something biological about your issue, and whatever that issue is, we'll throw some drugs at it. And that will fix the problem. But it doesn't fix the problem. It only masks the problem. It keeps the symptoms down, but you still have the problem. So the science of the mind that's practiced by medical doctors is called psychiatry, and they come from a medical view. Psychologists do not. Psychologists are not medically trained. Psychologists are trained in behavioral processes, and we believe that a problem can be simply the way that you learned, and it was inconsistent with the way that people behave in the world, and so you have a problem, a pathology, because you learned to behave the wrong way. Or there's depression in your life, or there's something else that's causing the issue that we as psychologists can fix through therapy, not necessarily through drugs. Now, we don't throw drugs out. We do believe that drugs are useful. We don't believe they're the be-all and end-all of solving your issue in psychology. Actually, in Spain, prior to the year 2004, to be a psychologist, you had to we get our clients in Spain from psychiatrists who referred them to us. And why would a psychiatrist refer a patient to a psychologist when they can do all the work themselves? So they sued and they said, no, we don't need the psychiatrists involved. If something comes up and we figure out that a person needs a psychiatrist, we can refer them back to the psychiatrist, but we can do a whole lot of work that the psychiatrist doesn't need to be involved in. And they won their point. In the United States, we have a similar issue where psychiatrists were stealing patients from the psychologists because a psychologist cannot prescribe drugs. They have to send their client to a psychiatrist to get the drugs. Well, then the psychiatrist would say, hey, I can do everything that the psychologist can do, so you don't need to go back to the psychologist. You can keep coming to see me. And so the psychologist sued in New Mexico, and they won the right to be able to prescribe drugs if they take the proper classes that a nurse practitioner also takes in order to prescribe drugs. And we'll talk about that in another section as well. Psychoanalysis is the talking cure. It is the way that psychiatrists will do therapy when they do therapy. And it is Freudian. It was created by Sigmund Freud. And we will talk much more about psychoanalysis because it is one of the methods that even psychologists use to help a patient through their problems through talking about it. Although it does work, and there are psychologists and psychiatrists that use it, so it's useful. Lots of students say, why are we studying Sigmund Freud? He's so old and he's so weird. Yes, he is. And the reason we study him is because his ideas still work today. And if it's useful, then it's practical. We'll continue to use it until we find something that's maybe so much better. There aren't very many things that are so much better. So that is psychoanalysis. And they refer to their people as patients, whereas psychologists refer to their people as clients. And there's a big difference between the two. We'll talk about that also in this class. So the term ology itself is actually from another language, and it means the field of study. So anything with ology after it, it means field of study. And psyche used to mean soul, but we can't prove the soul through science, so we call it the mind or the self. So the study, field of study of the mind is psychology, or the mind field of study. So literally, the mind field of study is psychology. So psychology is the science that studies behavior and mental processes of people, of individuals, not groups. Psychologists, however, study all behaviors, the good behaviors, the bad behaviors, mediocre behaviors. whereas psychiatrists are only interested in the bad behaviors, the abnormal behaviors, the pathological behaviors. So we study all kinds of behaviors, and there's a reason for that too. And if you go back to the Bible, and yeah, I use the Bible a lot as a reference, but if you go back to the Bible says that God created the earth and he said it was good. How did he know it was good? How do you define good? You have to define good by something else. And so in the Jewish tradition, there are other worlds out there, not just planets, but other worlds out there with other creatures on them that are similar to us. Because he had to be comparing it, it was good compared to that other thing. Right? So why do we study all behaviors? Because we want to know what the good behaviors are, what creates good behaviors, how we define the good behaviors, so we can very specifically define the abnormal pathological behaviors. That's why psychologists study all behaviors. And we will see in another lecture that there is a whole section of psychology that studies only positive behaviors. It's called positive psychology, and it was created in the 1990s. It's fairly new. So the goals of psychology are to describe, to explain, to predict, and to control behavior. We do not create behavior. A lot of people think we create behavior by making somebody do something, but all we've done is to control the behavior that already exists. We don't create new behavior. We make a particular behavior more prevalent than another behavior, and so the bad behavior sort of disappears as the new good behavior becomes more prevalent. So we don't create behavior, we control behavior, we predict behavior, we describe and we explain behavior. Now, applied psychologists also try to improve the quality of life, and you might think, well, that's another type of goal, to improve the quality of life, but the way they improve the quality of life is to control the behavior of the person that they're working with. So it's really just controlling behavior of a person whose quality of life is poor because their behavior doesn't fit into the society's role for them, or the role that they themselves describe themselves for. Yep. So psychologists study behavior and mental processes of individuals, and a behavior is the actions by which an organism adjusts to its surroundings. If it's cold, you put on a coat. It's your behavior adjusting to the surroundings. If it's hot, you take the coat off. So what is it that makes us behave in specific ways? That's one of the things that we want to figure out, the variables that make us behave in specific ways. We study individuals, although social psychologists study groups of people to see how the individual works within the group, and we make predictions about the behavior of all kinds of people. Now, a lot of students see that very narrowly. If I study Tanner, really see everything about Tanner, right? And I know everything about Tanner, can I then predict how somebody else is going to act by knowing how Tanner acts? In the chat. Victoria says no. Michael says no. Yes, you are correct. You can't study one person and know how everybody else is going to act. We don't actually study an individual. We study individuals. We study millions of individuals, and we know how people react in specific ways, and we know what the normal way people react is, and we know that there are different ways that people react, and we'll call that the normal distribution curve, and we'll talk about the normal distribution curve in the science section. So we have, in the normal distribution curve, we have a very narrow band in the normal distribution curve, which is 68% of the people which is one standard deviation within the data. One standard deviation on one side and the other side, negative and positive. That's 68% of the people is defined in the normal distribution curve. So that means that that is what we consider normal because it's 68%. It's the largest portion of the amount of behaviors that occur. There's a very wide range within there. It's not just one behavior. It's a whole range of behaviors that we consider normal. And then there's people on the outside edges that are abnormal, but that doesn't make them pathological. Just because you're not within the normal group does not make you pathological. There's a very specific definition for pathological, which we will see when we get to the pathology section. But you have to have more than just the fact that you're outside the norm. I can give you a good example of that, and that is how many of you are happy all the time? Anybody? Ooh. Tanner, I think you are pushing the norm there, but almost all the time. Okay, some almost all the time. The majority of people will say no. A minority of people will say they're happy a good deal of the time. Very, very, very few say all the time. But that doesn't make them pathological. The rest of us would like to be happy all the time. It would be great not to have sadness in our lives. So the abnormality of being happy all the time does not make it a pathology. Most people would like to be that way. So our knowledge gives us a starting point for dealing with individuals. We know that individuals are unique, and if somebody has a problem, they might not fit into the norm, and we may not be able to help them the way we normally help people, but we don't try to force them into the norm. We then change the way that we do our work to help the person to find a way to feel better about themselves. So if we go into the ancient past, in ancient China, almost 4,000 years ago, there were tests that were given by the emperor to determine if people were intelligent enough for government work. If somebody wanted to be in government work, if they wanted to work in the government, they had to take a test and they had to prove that they were intelligent enough to do so. Today, we let any idiot be in charge in the state governments, local governments. It doesn't matter where. If somebody wants to be in the government, we don't ask how intelligent they are or if they have any pathologies. We just let them, okay, we'll let you be in the government. If somebody can vote you in, then you get to be in the government. 2,400 years ago, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle considered the human psyche, that's where the word comes from, in their dissertations. Now, a lot of people have heard of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but they don't know the connections between them, so let me tell you a little bit about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates came first. He was the older gentleman who thought about the world differently. He looked at the world very differently than most people did in his day. He asked questions. Why is it we do things the way we're doing them? Why can't we do them differently? And the government would say, well, that's the way we've always done it. And he'd say, but does that make it right just because we've always done it that way? Isn't there a better way to do it? Can't we continuously improve? This is called the Socratic Method now today, asking questions in specific ways. Well, he caused a lot of problems for the government, and the government finally just said, look, they called him a gadfly, which means somebody getting into the works and jamming up the works. And they said, look, they arrested him. We're going to put you to death for being in the way of government working. You can kill yourself or we can kill you, one way or the other, or you're going to die. And so he picked taking hemlock, it's a poisonous plant, to kill himself. And we know this only because of Plato. Plato was one of his students. He actually had a school where people came, and he taught them this Socratic method, and Plato was one of his best students. And there is nothing that we know of that is actually written by Socrates. The only reason we know about Socrates is because people wrote about him, and Plato wrote about him, and that's the reason we know who Socrates is today. So Plato then started his own school, and people came to his school and learned, and one of the most well-known of his students is Aristotle. Aristotle learned what he needed to learn, and he went out on his own to be a teacher, and he wandered into a land where the king, the emperor of that land, knew who he was and had just had a child and wanted Aristotle to come live at the palace and be the teacher for his child. Well, who's going to say no to living in a palace, right? You get the best food, you get all the best everything at the palace. So he went to the palace and he taught the child of the king. The child of the king's name was Alexander, who became Alexander the Great. And that's why we know about these people, because of the way that they interact in history. So what they said, some of the things they said: emotions distort thoughts. And we know this to be true today. And you know, a lot of you are in high school, and you may have developed a crush on somebody, and your friends are like, what is wrong with you? You are acting just weird. And it's because your emotions are overpowering your thought processes. And we know that people who are angry will not think properly and get into trouble, and that's why we have anger management. And there's all kinds of ways that we can show that they are correct. Emotions distort your thoughts, your thinking processes. Perceptions are interpretations, and we have an entire chapter on this, sensation and perception. And so they were correct on this as well. Sensation is how our body brings in the information, but then perception is how our brain perceives that information. We'll talk about that in the sensation and perception chapter. They also said emotions come from the heart and the liver, and we know that no, that's not right. You can have a very, very horrible, nasty person who dies, and their heart is given to a person who's wonderful and loving, and that person that's wonderful and loving doesn't become nasty because they got the heart of a nasty person. So emotions do not come from the heart and the liver. We actually know where in the brain emotions are from now, and we'll talk about the limbic system in the biology section. So mental disorders are caused by too much bile. I have no idea what that means. I guess if you have mental abnormalities, then you just stick your finger down your throat and throw up, and then get rid of all that bile that's in you, and maybe that's how you fix yourself. Obviously, that's wrong. But this is science. This is the way science works. Now, they were more philosophical than science, and we'll talk about the difference when we get to the science section. But you do find things that you are correct about, and you find things that you are wrong about. And when your hypothesis is wrong, you tell everybody that this doesn't work, and you find out the reasons why it doesn't work and how it will work, and that's science. It's a continuous process. Sometimes people come out and say things that are wrong, and other scientists test it and find out it is wrong, and then we move on from there. We don't just lambast a person simply because their theory or hypothesis was wrong. we move on and prove other hypotheses. Science goes back to the ancient Greeks, but the Catholic Church decided that the mind and the soul operated outside of nature. The soul is not biological, according to the Catholic Church, and if it's not biological, then the only person that should be studying the soul is a member of the church, a bishop, a monk, right? Somebody that's high up in the church. Anybody else that's studying it, we're going to excommunicate you or worse. And so they basically shut down the sciences. They did not shut down school. They created some of the greatest universities. But the purpose of the universities at that point was to prove the pontifications of the Pope. That was the purpose of those schools. Now today those schools still exist and they're more scientific today than they were in the past. But that's a restriction of thought process rather than an expansion of thought process. So the Dark Ages, as I call them, ended when the church lost its control and Luther started his church, the Reformation began, and the people who were in charge of the new religions didn't have as much control, didn't want as much control as the Catholic Church wanted. And so they opened up for other people to study some of the things that couldn't be studied during the time the church controlled it, the Catholic Church controlled it. Descartes was born in 1596 and died in 1650, and he's one of the first philosophers that we really talk about. I will never ask you a date of a person when they were born or when they died. I'm putting the date in there specifically so you see how far in the past this person existed and how close to our time they existed, so that you can see a time frame. That's the only reason I'm putting these dates in. If you're in a master's degree program in psychology, you will have to memorize those dates, but I'm not asking you to. So just remember, the only reason I have those in is because I want you to see where they exist in time. So Descartes did agree with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle that sensation responses are based on the human nervous system, and so we can study and learn how it functions. He also refused to accept the obviousness of his own senses. He believed in the difference between sensation and perception. What he knew comes from the brain, and the brain is an interpretation of the world, not the world. The brain does not see, the brain does not smell, the brain does not taste. The brain gets electrical signals and then interprets those electrical signals. So in the search for a foundation of philosophy, and he was a philosopher, not a psychologist, whatever could be doubted had to be rejected, and Descartes resolved to trust only what is clearly and distinctly found to be beyond any doubt, using what we call today the scientific method. So that's Descartes, and that starts us into the journey that brings us to the psychological sciences. So in the 1800s, psychological studies took on a much more scientific rather than philosophical tone. Wundt and James are the first two really well-known scientific psychologists. Wilhelm Voot was born in 1832 and died in 1920. He started what's called the School of Structuralism, which was the view that tried to uncover the basic structures which make up the mind. What is it inside the mind? What are the structures of the mind that cause us to behave and think in specific ways? He started the very first scientific laboratory in the world devoted to psychology, and it was in Leipzig, Germany. He is the father of structuralism because he created the whole thought process of structuralism. And one of his students was a man named Titchener, who was from England. He was born in since he was from England, he knew English, and he also studied in Germany, so he knew German, and he brought structuralism to the United States through his translation from German to English, and rather than going back to England, he came to the United States. He did a really bad job of the interpretation from German to English, but it was enough to get people in the United States excited about the fact that psychology could be a science rather than a philosophy. Wilhelm Voot was the very first person to call himself a psychologist in a paper, so really that's where psychology begins, and certainly that's where scientific psychology begins. So we consider him the father of scientific psychology, Wilhelm Voot. Now in the United States, at Harvard University, we had a man named William James, again, right around the same time frame, 1842 to 1910. He said that physical responses are the source of our emotions, and we will talk about that in the emotion chapter, the James Lang theory of emotions. He wrote The Principles of Psychology, which was a group of 2 books, which is considered a really good treatise on psychology even today. Even though it has a lot of misconceptions in it, it still brought the idea of psychology into the scientific realm. Like I said, science, some things are wrong and some things are right. We finally throw out the bad things and we continue on with the good things. So James is considered the first true American psychologist and the father of what he called functionalism, not structuralism. So he created this idea of the function of the brain is more important than the structure of the brain. The functionists believed that mental processes could best be understood in terms of their adaptive purposes and functions. Now, we're talking about 1842 to 1910. This is the time frame when Darwin was really big, and adaptive means, why do we do the things we do? Because our ancestors did them and survived, and so that process has passed itself down to us. The function of what they did helped them to survive and helps us to survive. And again, I can use the Bible as a good reference here. How many of you believe that, let's say, put down either one of these 2 things in the chat box. You believe that we have more jealousy in the world, or we have more trust in the world? Which one do you believe, jealousy or trust? Jealousy, 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 jealousy. I would agree with you 100%. There's a lot more jealousy in the world than there is trust, but some people do believe that trust exists and is more prevalent than jealousy. But I believe it's more jealousy, and I can prove this adaptively. The reason we are jealous is because it was adaptive in the past. And I'm going to use the Bible again. Cain was jealous. Abel was trusting. Cain killed Abel. Abel had no children, and Cain had children. That's why we have more jealousy today than trust. The trust died with Abel. How's that? That's adaptive. That shows adaptation, right? Adaptation. Hopefully that clicks in you, but it's not actually true because we have no connection to either one of them. The Bible shows that we are actually descended from the 3rd brother, Seth, but you get the idea. See, if you killed out something, then it couldn't go forward in the gene process, and no future people would have it. So you have a good idea of what it means to be adaptive, a process to be adaptive. So functionalists and structuralists really disliked each other. They cast aspersions on each other all the time, and it's kind of ridiculous. Today we don't even talk about functionalism and structuralism. We've thrown those ideas out, and we have different ways of looking at the human being today. But let me show you why this is kind of weird. How do you define a train? if you wanted to define a train, tell me what a train is in the chat bar. Anybody can give me an explanation of what a train is. Define a train. In just a few words. You don't have to put the whole, give me a whole paragraph. One of the first types of transportation. Okay, that's good. I like that. Good description, right? Metal. Okay, right there, right? We already have two different definitions. Oh, great. Railroad cars, okay. A mode of transportation that runs on rails. Excellent. I like that. That's good. All right. We have two different types of explanations here. We have a function. It is a type of transportation. And we have a structure. It is metal and railroad cars. Now, if you just told me that a train is metal and railroad cars, I don't know anything about the train. I know its structure, but I don't know anything about what it does. And if you tell me it's a means of transportation, but you don't tell me how it actually works, the function, and how the structure is put together, the rail system, right, then I know very little about its structure. You have to know both. In order to know the mind, you've got to know its function and its structure, both. And so it's kind of weird that they hated each other and fought against each other all the time because they need each other. You've got to be able to know both things in order to find something properly. Right? So that is functionalism and structuralism, and we've basically thrown those ideas out today. We do understand that they're necessary to know them, but we talk about the brain in different ways now. So coming closer to the present, we have 1844 to 1924. Actually, that's right in the same time frame. G. Stanley Hall, he studied under Wundt, and he returned to the United States. He was from the United States. He returned to the United States, and he started the very first laboratory devoted to psychology in the United States. Now, remember, William James is the first psychologist, but the laboratories that he had to study psychology were specifically for his students, not to study psychology, but for his students to be able to understand psychology, the functions of psychology. And G. Stanley Hall started the first laboratory devoted specifically to psychology to figure out what is psychology, not just for students. Hall also founded the American Psychological Association, the APA, which is, again, for some of you, a horrible thing because you have MLA and APA formats that you have to figure out. And that's where APA comes from, the American Psychological Association. And of course, some of you have asked me, do I want MLA or APA in your essay? And I've told you, I certainly don't want MLA. I am a psychologist. I want APA, but I don't ask you to do APA. That's not what I'm here to teach you. That's a higher level course. This is a freshman level course. So he was the first president of the APA. Francis Cecil Sumner, 1895 to 1954, now we're coming really close to our time frame, is considered the father of Black American psychology, the first African-American with a PhD in psychology, but he's not the one that most people think of. Most people, when they consider African-American psychologists, think of Kenneth Clark. Kenneth Clark was born in 1915 and died in the year 2000, very close to our time here. He was the APA's first African-American president in the 1970s, 1970 and 71. And it was Clark's experiment with children and dolls that helped to end segregation in the United States. Now, we say it was his experiment, but it wasn't his experiment. It was his wife's experiment, and his wife was Mamie Phipps, and then Clark, because she married him, so Mamie Phipps Clark. It was her experiment for her master's and PhD, and she took dolls that were exactly the same shape, the same facial features, everything was the same except for the color of their skin. She had white dolls, black dolls, red dolls, and yellow dolls. And she gave them to children to play with. And the children, no matter what the child was, African American, Asian, Indian, didn't matter. They played with the white dolls more than playing with any of the other dolls. You would expect, well, an African American child would play with an African American doll, and an Asian child would play with the Asian doll, right? Color of our skin, we would look at the color of our skin and try to get to the closest doll that looked like us, but that's not what happened. And when she asked the children, can you tell the difference? She's like, do you see a difference? Yes, they saw the difference. They knew the difference. Why did you play with the white doll? So the white doll is good. What does that mean? Segregation in and of itself creates a negative process. It is by itself and alone discriminatory. Segregation, even though you say this person has the same things as this person, but they have to have it differently, you know, in a different place. You have your water fountain, we have our water fountain. You have your bathroom, we have our bathroom. It is discriminatory. It creates a problem in and of itself. And so it was one of the experiments that the Supreme Court used to say, okay, we're ending discrimination. And that's Kenneth and Mamie Phipps Clark. When we talk about Mamie Phipps as a woman in psychology, we should go back and look at some of the other women in psychology as well. There are currently more women getting PhDs, doctor degrees in psychology than men. So if you're interested in psychology as a woman, no, there are more women getting them today than there are men getting PhDs in psychology. Margaret Washburn was born in 1871, died in 1939. She was the first woman with a PhD in psychology. She got it from Cornell in 1894. But she should not have been the first one. She should have been the second one, because Mary Calkins finished all of her work and her dissertation and defended her dissertation for her PhD before Margaret Washburn did. But Mary Calkins, who was the first woman president of the APA, was at Harvard. She had gotten special permission to go to Harvard because segregation is not just about black and white. It was about Irish, Jewish, women and men, and Harvard did not accept women at the college. Now, she got special permission to sit in the classes, but when she finished her degree, when she finished all of her classes, and she did her research and defended her research. What does that mean, defend your research? You do research, you come up with a result, and then you stand in front of 5 different people who already have their PhDs in your particular discipline, and you defend it because they say, well, why did you do this? Why didn't you do this? Why do you think the results mean this? And you have to say, this is the reason I did the work, and this is why I believe it's correct, and defend it against people who already know your particular discipline. One of the people on her dissertation committee on defending against was William James, the premier psychologist of the United States. And he said she did a better job defending her dissertation than any male had ever done at Harvard, and told Harvard that she should get her degree. And Harvard said, no, go to Radford. It's right next door, and that's the all-women's school, and she can get her PhD from Radford. And she didn't. But she became the first president of the APA that's a woman. And then Harvard said, maybe we should give her a degree. And she told them to shove it. So she never did have her PhD. So Radford and actually Harvard are now one college. There's really not a Radford anymore, since they've combined and we've become 2 sexes in the same college now. Actually, when I went to the University of Georgia, I was at one of the dorms that was the first multi-sex dorm. There was girls on one side of the dorm, guys on the other side of the dorm. Before that, they were girl dorms and they were guy dorms, and you didn't mix the two. So in my day, it was the first year that women were allowed to wear pants at the University of Georgia. I mean, they they told women, you have to wear dresses and skirts. You can't wear pants before my day. Some of you don't realize how much has changed in a lifetime of your parents, right, and your grandparents. Yeah, I'm that old. So Ruth Howard, we say, was the very first African-American woman to get a PhD from the University of Minnesota. She got it in the 1930s. She was born 1900 to 1997, and she got her degree in Minnesota because she would never have gotten her degree in the South. The South didn't allow African-Americans in her time frame. African-Americans didn't, the first African-American to graduate from Auburn was 1964. 1964. Alabama didn't allow African-Americans in until 1962. Again, a lot of change has happened in just one lifetime. So that's the history of psychology. And now we get into a little bit of the modern perspectives of psychology and more of the science of psychology. The different ways that we looked at psychology by the structural and functional in the old days are different today. We look at them in the perspective of how people do their research and where they're more interested. Now, of course, I've already told you I was a biologist. I got my bachelor's degree in biology. I was going to be a veterinarian, and then I moved into psychology. So you might think that biology is my favorite, and it is not, which gives you some indication of where my favorite is now. You have broken out one of them. And this is actually your discussion question, which is your favorite. After I've described all of these, try to figure out which one really talks to you. One of them will be more interesting to you than another one, than all the rest of them. And your discussion question is, which one? This is not a wrong or right question. This is your opinion, and then defend why it is that that makes more sense to you than another one does. So we have the biological, the psychodynamic, evolutionary, humanistic, cognitive, behavioral, and sociocultural. These are the ones I'm going to talk about. So the biological perspective is actually has a subdivision called the behaviorists, and we'll talk about the behaviorism in the next one. But the biological view says we are complex systems that respond to heredity and environmental influences. Right? We have adapted to the world, and what determines our behavior is our neural structures, our biology, our brains, our biochemistry, and the innate responses, the things that are built into us because they were adaptive in the past to our external cues in the world. The focus of study then is the nervous system, the endocrine system, both of which we will study in the second chapter, and the biological genetic disorders that occur because of our biology and the issues that occur because of our births and our conception. So that is the biological view. The behavioral view was developed by a man named Watson. He was born in 1878. He died in 1958. He's considered the father of behaviorism. And then there's Skinner, and we'll talk about both of these in the learning chapter because they're both learning psychologists. Skinner was born 1904, and he died in 1990. And Skinner, actually, his students created what we call radical behaviorism, and we'll talk about the difference when we get to the learning chapter. But behaviorism, or behavioral view of psychology, is that we respond to our surroundings according to the principles of behavioral learning. We can develop a formula that determines what variables are important and what variables are less important, and we can see in our lives what variables created the behaviors that we have today. So what determines our behaviors is the stimulus cues, the things that happen in our world, the history of our rewards and punishments, and no merit is given to internal mental processes. We don't think about, the bell is ringing and so I need to go to the next class. The thought process is not important. We have been trained and our brain reacts to the bell, and we move to the next class because our brain has a pattern in it. We don't have to think about it. It's just a pattern of behavior that occurs. And we'll see why in the learning chapter, why that makes sense. You can actually say that our brain has developed a pattern of connections because the neurons that fire together wire together, and we'll see that in the learning chapter when we talk about Pavlov. But no merit is given to our internal mental processes in behaviorism. The focus of study then is that formula, the laws, connecting our responses to stimulus conditions in the environment. The next one is the cognitive group, and this is completely different, opposed to the behaviorist group, because they believe we think, we know we think, and they say thinking is very important. So the cognitive people they fight with the behavioral people all the time. And in my day, when I went to the University of Georgia, there was one cognitive psychologist at Georgia, because they felt like they had to have somebody in the cognitive field. But he had a basement office, and he was given the worst office in the entire place. So the view of the cognitive psychologist is that organisms are information processing systems. Like computers, we process information and determine what it is that is happening to us and make our decisions based on our past memories. So what determines behavior is interpretation of experiences by means of our mental processing. And the focus of study then is those mental processes, including sensation, perception, learning, memory, and even language changes the way that we behave, depending on what language we use. And we'll see some of that later in another chapter as well. That's the cognitive group. The psychodynamic group is Freud's group. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856. He died in 1939. He's the father of the psychodynamic group. The view of human nature for these people is also called the Psychoanalytic Approach. We are irrational people. Human beings are not rational. We are irrational. We are driven by unconscious motives. We don't even know why we do things sometimes. We have needs that we don't even recognize that drive us. We have desires and conflicts sometimes that we don't even recognize. Now, we can also recognize them, but one of the most interesting parts of the psychodynamic view is the unconscious. And we'll study that in another unit. What determines our behavior is the unconscious needs, conflicts, and repressed memories from early development. This is really strange for some students, but it doesn't matter to Freud what happened to you after the age of 21. Every pathology, every problem that occurs, no matter how old you are, occurs because of something that happened to you in the first 20 years of your life, and most because of the first just 5 or 6 years of your life. And we'll study that, the psychosexual stages it's called. We'll talk about those in another unit. The focus of study then is the abnormal behaviors, things that happen that aren't normal. He didn't care about normal people. He cared about the people with pathologies. As a reflection of unconscious motives, applications of this theory then to psychotherapy for treating mental disorders. The humanistic group is a fairly new group. Carl Rogers was born in 1902, died in 1987, and Abraham Maslow was born in 1908 and died in 1970. You can see they're right along with each other, and they liked each other, they knew each other, and they collaborated together. The humanistic view is the third view in psychology. Before that, you only had the psychodynamic and the behavioral. Those were the two views that everybody talked about. And then the humanistic view came along. According to them, we have free will, but we act in accordance with our self-concept. Let me give you a little example of this, since you all are in high school. When I was in high school, well, most of you are in high school. When I was in high school, there was this girl in high school. Oh my gosh, she was beautiful. If you were ranking people on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 was absolutely gorgeous, she was a 10.5. And I would have loved to have asked her out to go out on a date, okay? But I was only a 5. I was not a good-looking kid in high school. So I didn't ask her out because 10s don't go out with 5s. Right? 5s and 10s, you don't see them together very often. There's a time when they do, and we'll talk about that also in the motivation chapter. But they don't go out together. We don't go after lost causes, okay? We don't go after lost causes, and that's a lost cause. All right, now most of you are saying exactly what, the problem is I saw myself, my self-concept was a 5, but everybody that knew me saw me as an 8. And an 8 and a 10, they have a good chance of going out with each other. We usually don't go more than 2 away from our beauty level. Right? It's a matching hypothesis we talk about later. She might have gone out with me. I have free will. I could have asked her out, but my own self-concept kept me from asking her out. Do you get that? So what determines our behavior? Our self-concepts, our perceptions, our interpretations of relationships, our interpersonal relationships, our need for personal growth. Need for personal growth is an important aspect for them too. Your mindset, yes. So the focus of study is life patterns, values, goals, self-actualization of individuals, and applications to psychotherapy. Now, the self-actualization is a really big thing. You may recognize Abraham Maslow's hierarchy, pyramid of self-actualization. The top of the pyramid is self-actualization, and we will talk about that in another unit. But they believe that self-actualization is a need, a drive. If something stops us from going forward, from becoming better, then we develop a pathology because of it. My mom used to say that the last day of your life, the day you die, should be the best day of your life because you should always be striving to improve yourself every single day. She was a humanist and didn't know it. That's the humanistic side. Now, the evolutionary side, I have a little bit of an issue with. This is not creation versus evolution. It's not about how we got here on Earth. It's about how we changed because we're on Earth. So don't, feel like it is opposing your view of creationism. This is not about creationism. The way I talk about evolution, it's about we're here on Earth. We've been here on Earth over 5,000 years. The Bible says so. So how have we changed over those 5,000 years? And we're definitely different than we were even 100 years ago, human beings. That's what it means for evolution. So we are adapted to deal with problems of ancient human environments. That's how our body is defined or described. It is by the adaptation of, as I talked about, Cain and Abel, right? We're more jealousy in the world because jealousy survived. So mechanisms that are inherited through natural selection are the ones that we are looking at, determine our behavior, and the focus of study is evolved behaviors that have conferred survival or reproductive advantage or both. And my problem with this group is not the theories that they make up, because they have really great theories, but the fact that they don't have to test them. And I'm a scientist. I believe we should test our theories, but you can't put a person in a laboratory and see how they evolve. We can put microbes in a laboratory and we can see how they evolve, but we can't see how a person evolves. And this is my issue with them. And here's an example of that. We are very different than the great apes. Right? Let's take gorillas, for instance. We are very different than gorillas are. We come from the same ancestor. Somewhere down the line, we're 98% the same as a chimpanzee, our genetics, 98%. Somewhere down the line, there was an ancestor that was the same that broke off and became the great apes and human beings. There's a good difference between the two that you can see easily, and that is that the great apes have fur all over their body, and humans don't, unless you're Italian. I'm kidding. We have hair lot less hair than great apes do. But there's a big difference between our hair. Our hair continues to grow on our heads, and for men, some men, on their faces. Great apes, they grow hair only about so much, and then it stops growing. It doesn't continue growing. They don't have to go to the barber to get their haircuts. So somewhere down the line in our ancient past, in that ancestor that was the same, there was a mutation that occurred. And the mutation was that some of them started growing their hair continuously. That group turned into humans. The reason they turned into humans, the reason it made a difference, is because reproductively and survival, we have to stand up on 2 feet and run, or we will trip over our hair and get caught by the wolf, the lion, the bear, whatever it is. So that ancestor had to learn to stand up and run on 2 feet. And great apes mostly walk on 4. They can walk on 2, but they don't do it for very long. And we don't do it at all, we do it 2. Prove me wrong. And that's the reason I have a problem with the evolutionary group. I have a theory. It fits the survival and reproductive group too. And you can't prove me wrong because there's no way to scientifically prove what I just said. That's my problem with the evolutionary group. And it's 9:15, so our class is now over. If you are from the other class, from the 12:30 class, and if you are one of the 2 people that didn't show up, stay here to talk to me. Otherwise, you guys can go. I will see you guys on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. I like that, Colby. I see you, Kiana. You are here. I got you. Thank you very much for staying. I see you, Bailey. I got you. You are marked as present. Thank you, Bailey. I got you, Giselle. Thank you very much. You can leave. I got you marked down. You are marked as present, Tara. So you can leave. Class is over.